Welcome to the D&D Fitness Radio podcast, brought to you by your hosts, Don Saladino from New York City and Derek Hansen from Vancouver, Canada.
Thank you for the good words. So when I was talking to Derek the other day, you were, I want to say, was Brett our first guest? Or maybe like the first?
One of many.
I think I was like fifth.
Yeah.
Third.
We didn't want to waste the first one on him because
you had Ryan, I think, on. Ryan, I think you had Ryan.
Yeah, no, we could fuck that up all day. He doesn't mind. I mean, that's totally. He was our test run, and then we might have thrown on Annie Hathaway or someone like that, and then after that, we were like, we're ready.
Yeah,
we're ready. But I don't know. I think we've all evolved a lot since then. So that's got to be going on 2 years now. So
for sure. Yeah, no, it would have. What are we, 2020? It actually would have been 3, I think, because we had just moved to Atlanta. We were in a house we were renting because we had literally just moved from LA. So, and we've been here like 3.5 years. So that was quite a while ago.
Yeah, 2018, January, I think, or February, around there. I think it was, yeah.
Wow, time flies, man.
Yep.
It does.
We're all here. So I feel like that there's so much more to talk about. And Brett, really, you're like one of those coaches out there when you look at coaches that really, when I say wear a lot of different hats, I don't want to say that as an insult, as in like you're diluting what you're doing. No, like you are someone that wears a lot of different hats. Like you're an exceptional coach, you're a motivator, you're able to be brought in now by companies that need help, not only motivating, but maybe, they're hiring you for guidance, right? I mean, there's so many different hats that you wear now. And I think it's impressive. And I think there's only a handful of coaches out there that are able to do that. And Derek's about to say something.
We're all wearing hats here. What is the reason? I know my hair just sucks right now. So why are you guys wearing hats?
I was coaching, and so this is coaching attire. And so I'm wearing a stocking cap.
Okay.
That's why, because it's like 20 or 30 degrees here.
Oh, I get paid big money every time I wear this, so that's the only reason why.
Big money.
I'm just kidding. No, I'm actually we actually had a snowstorm the other day, and I'm freezing my ass off. So yeah, that's why I'm wearing the hat indoors.
Yeah, I appreciate the hats. I remember a George Carlin bit on hats where he said hats and religions confuse him because Christian men cannot wear hats in church, but women can. And then in Catholicism, there's a different kind of hat. And then if you're Jewish, men have to wear a hat, but in other religions, you can't. There's a lot of hats, with religion. And he goes, frankly, I don't want to be a part of any religion where there's rules around hats. And he just went on his typical Carlin rant, but it was so funny because it made you realize, there is a fascination with headgear in religion, but I digress. I just thought it was a funny aside.
But might I add that we all have nice heads of hair too. So it's not like we're covering that up.
Luscious.
We can admit that we do right now still have our hair. I'm knocking on wood here right now.
Are we recording? Is this part of the podcast?
Hell yeah!
I hope so.
It's so funny. There's no glamorous intro. There's no we're not even going to tell anyone who you are. Like they're going to have to figure it out in time.
No, but don't you know I live in America? America is cancel culture. So somebody's going to be like, note to self, he talked about religion. They're burning conscious coaching in the streets. I'm just like,
well, we talked about all religions, so we're safe.
Yeah, there we go. That's true.
If we're talking about only one religion, then suddenly it's a difference.
But the bald lobby will be coming after us.
So. Derek, what I want to know is on your green screen, can you bring a Mandalorian? Can you go to the set of like the Mandalorian or something?
Let's see. What do I got here?
That's what I usually wear for interviews, Don. I usually just wear that. The Mandalorian.
Oh, I see what you're pointing. I thought you were pointing at Incognito's jersey. I didn't know what you were saying.
No, that's over here. Mandalorian.
Richie, again, that's one of the coolest last names I've ever heard of a football player.
Oh, it's the best.
Don't you just love it? Like Incognito. Like it's amazing.
And what's even better is nobody could be less incognito than him because of his personality and his admitted, right, like bipolar disorder. Like that's what this wall is. This wall is actually athletes that have overcome certain afflictions, and they don't mind me saying this, alcoholism, mental illness. There's a wide variety. There's a group over here that their coach died of cancer. So the whole point of this wall is not to showcase just, look at athletes that I've trained. This is it's a resilience wall so that when my son grows up, we can say talent or advantages are not enough. every single one of these people has a story. Over there is a guy that lost one of his limbs overseas in the military, and they told him he'd never run again. We were a part of helping him run again with his new kind of, what they reconstructed with his limb. And so everything in here is about a story of something that somebody's overcome, so that my kid never thinks that anything's ever owed to him.
I love that. I've been trying on social media every Sunday to feature someone like I call it one to follow, right? Like it's one to follow. And that's when you said that, I immediately thought of, like, I didn't know that about Richie Incognito, or I didn't know that about Thompson, or, it's, you start thinking about people who become great at something, and most of them that I've met have had some type of adversity that they had to face, or some type of, issue, chip, call it what you want, but it wasn't always smooth sailing for them at a certain period, and it wasn't for you either. And you were very open to admit that. I know it wasn't for me. It definitely wasn't. I think that's something that some of our people, if you're comfortable with, would love to hear, because it is very motivating.
Yeah, I mean, it's how I got into coaching. And I probably don't tell this story much anymore, because I assume, like we all do, that one, I get tired of hearing myself talk. And two, you think that because you've told it before, whether I've written a book about it or whatever, that just a lot of people know, right? You have that imposter phenomenon. Like, there's 8 billion people in the world, maybe 20,000, and I'm being gratuitous, have heard my story, but you feel like they've heard it enough, but yeah, it's just it's how I got into coaching. I was a competitive athlete as a kid. My parents had just got a divorce, so we moved to a different school district, and my core group of friends went to a different high school. I certainly had a good group of friends at my new high school, but by my sophomore year, a lot of them had gotten into hardcore drugs, specifically methamphetamines, cocaine. I mean, serious shit. And I didn't really identify with that. Not that I was like better than them, just high school really wasn't for me, right? Like, I was a pretty serious kid. And I think a lot of that may have been like, we lost a lot of family members early in life. And my parents like always inculcated in me, like, whether it was something like, don't let somebody you love go a day without knowing it or whatever, because we just lost. I mean, I lost all my grandparents by the time I was like 15, right? So it just seemed like a lot of funerals. I was a super intense kid. And so, long story short, when I didn't hang around with those friends anymore, I channeled everything into training. And this was actually something that I had gotten featured in Muscle and Fitness, like back in 2009, I think. But I basically developed an eating disorder because I became so obsessed with training and exercise as a way to deal with anxiety and depression, that like I was exercising all the time. And it was during the time when like low fat and low carb were both in vogue. So I followed both, like any good absolutist, because it wasn't like now, where like you can find this information anywhere. Like, I'm 14, like you're at bodybuilding.com, you're like going to whatever's online. I'm reading Men's Health. And that was before Men's Health was as discerning as it was now about its content when these things are spoken about. So all I knew is, to get lean, you need to burn more calories than you eat. So I had no idea about basal metabolic rate. I'm literally thinking, okay, I ate 2,000 calories of like egg beaters and fat-free Kraft singles and lunch meat and whatever, or turkey bacon. Now I got to go burn that if I want to get ripped, because I need to get ripped to be good at sports, right? Which is all kinds of wrong, but that's what I thought. So I blacked out one day when running. I used to run a ton. I blacked out one day when running around the base of our high school, because it was a massive high school, and like 3 times around was a mile. And when I woke up, I was in the doctor's office, and they were like, "Hey, your heart, kidney, and liver are near failure," right? Like, I was to the point when the initial shock of hot or cold could send me into cardiac arrest. So I was put in an outpatient eating disorder hospital, had to go see a lot of psychologists, psychiatrists, and I tried talking to them about how I just felt angry and anxious and kind of depressed, dealing with family getting divorced, friends doing drugs, whatever. And I'll never forget, there was one guy in particular, and I'm not going to use his name, but let's call him Dr. Bo. And he would just look at you and be like, "This isn't you talking, this is the disorder." And I'm like looking around like, no, like, I'm sitting here telling you what's up, what I'm struggling with. And because I look this way, you're assuming I'm lying to you and it's something else, right? He wanted to make the topic about food because I looked skinny. It's almost like saying that somebody, just because they're black, like, looks sketchy. You know what I mean? And
Right.
and I'm not going to compare my shit to racial divides or whatever, but I'm just giving an example. And I remember eventually, none of these treatment options worked, because out of patient stuff, they don't let you exercise, and they just force feed you a bunch of shit food. Like, you legitimately have to eat just high caloric crap. And if you like are like, "Hey, I don't Like, for example, I've never liked mayonnaise. Nothing to do with
Oh,
health,
I've
right?
never tried it. I've never tried it.
Dude, I just hate it. And I remember one time in this place, like, you didn't get a choice what to eat. You had to eat like tuna salad, fries, and a milkshake or whatever, because they just want you to regain weight. And I'm like, I don't like mayonnaise. And they're like, well, that's not you. That's not honest. That's the eating disorder talking. And I'm like, no, I don't like mayonnaise. And you're not heard, dude. You're put in these places that are like prisons. And so what I would do is because it cultivated more anger, is at night when I'd get to go home, I would just sneak out and I'd go to like 24-hour fitness because I had a learner's permit, and so I could drive. I'd leave at like 11 o'clock at night when my parents were asleep. I knew the garage code, and I'd go work out for 2 to 3 hours at 24-hour. Well, I just kept losing weight. So eventually I was hospitalized in an inpatient eating disorder hospital. Spent a year of my life there where the metric, like the KPI, and I think, Derek, you'd appreciate this, right? We look at all the statistics in sports and how people misinterpret it and what have you. A lot of times, whether it's ACL injuries or hamstrings, the main KPI that allows you to leave this hospital is your BMI, right? Like your BMI of all things. Now, granted, I was 90 pounds at this point, so no question I wasn't healthy, but using BMI as a sole indicator of health is bullshit. Like Kettle, the guy that invented that, basically rigged the equation just to make it work, and is really the guy responsible for the whole concept of the average man. Like what's average? And we know that there is no average. But long story short, you spend most of your day in this day room where you're observed nearly for 8 hours. You can't read certain books, you can't watch certain TV because they don't want dieting messages or what have you. So I listened to music, man, and just did a lot of thinking and keeping to myself. But you'd also talk to a lot of patients in there that you share that room with, and you start realizing that there's so much stuff that people deal with that manifests itself as something else. Like, not one person was in there because they're like, I'm scared of being fat. There was a junior Olympic wrestler who was beaten by his father, and so diet and exercise became a form of control. A woman whose husband left her, yada, yada, yada. And so, when I had gotten out of there eventually, I just remember, one, I was fascinated with, like, I had to regain a lot of weight to get my health back. And so I learned more about strength and conditioning because I stole 2 books when I got to leave the hospital one day as like a day pass. One was about strength and conditioning, one was about nutrition. And I just was like, you know what, this is what I want to do. And more importantly, from a psychological standpoint, I want to be able to bridge the gap, because any athlete that I work with is probably like us in that performance isn't like what drives them. They don't come to the gym and they're like, yeah, I can't wait to squat 400 pounds today. They want to just get faster, get their family out of poverty, escape a bad situation, whatever. And so all of that is what led to me coaching, and specifically looking at like communication and psychology as a different kind of underpinning driver of how to reach people and get the most out of them.
So what was one of your motivating factors then? Like, you started reading books on strength and conditioning, but you went from this really dark place where, I mean, you technically almost probably died, right? I mean, you were in bad shape, and then you went on to become, a very well known, very well respected strength and conditioning coach. Um, like, how does that, like, that's just not out of luck. Like, that's like someone.
No. Well, I mean, like, so when I got out of there, and I had to study, what was not working was me following this fitness route that I was reading in magazines, or this hospitalization route, which was basically force feed you and don't let you exercise, which, again, like, it's not intelligent, and I'm not bragging about it, but like, you find when you put people in situations where you restrict shit, they find sneaky ways to get it. Right. And so, like, at night, even in my room, I would do push-ups and jumping jacks because you're just sitting all day. And again, I'm like 90 pounds at the time. So sitting's probably what I needed, but that wasn't a healthy reintegration in things. I mean, Derek, imagine an athlete coming back from an injury and that old idea of like, oh, you had a torn ACL on your right side. Yeah, don't train your left side. Don't train your upper limbs either. Like, just let everything atrophy, whatever. And that's their idea. And so, having been somebody that athletics were a big part of our family, having been now in this situation where I nearly died, if I did learn one thing in the hospitals, I learned more about how metabolism really works, because you had to meet with dietitians and all these kinds of things. And knowing that basically within 3 months, I gained nearly 50 pounds. The human body's pretty incredible. So I remember when I was looking at colleges, I started investigating who had the best kinesiology program or who had a good one. And that led me to do that at Kansas State University. And then I got an internship at Athletes Performance, which is now a different company. And that was my first foray into really training athletes outside of, I was a competitive boxer in college. So I trained other fighters in exchange for my training. It was kind of like a work for training kind of thing. Because as I was getting my degree, you learned a little bit about that. But my first formal experience outside of that was in these internships, and then going to Nebraska and working with athletes, and then getting my master's degree. And my master's degree, I was the head strength coach for 6 sports and assistant for 2, because it was a really good program at Southern Illinois that they paid for your master's as long as you worked basically as a full-time strength coach. And at the time I was studying cueing, or what's called attentional focus, which is cool, right? It's the idea that what you say and how you focus somebody's attention, Don, is like, that's going to change the outcome, right? If you use a lot of verbal diarrhea and a lot of technical jargon, as you would imagine, it tends to cloud somebody's performance. Whereas if you base it off an outcome, but that in and of itself, I was like, all right, well, this is fascinating. If I give somebody an analogy and a metaphor and simplify it, I can help them jump higher or do this. But it's deeper than that. Then I wanted to look at influence. What else influences us? If it's the words we use, what about the environment? What about the timing? What about all these things? And a lot of that led me down the path of essentially saying, hey, human behavior is pretty tricky shit. And I lived that. I saw that. People are complex. I remember my athletes telling me when I asked them, why do you come? They're like, well, your workouts are good. And I'm like, yeah, that's all right. But there's people like Derek and people like you and other people that write really good training sessions as well. And so I annoyed the shit out of them. It was Don Terry Poe, who was formerly with the Chiefs, as you know, Derek, like, who got so annoyed with me asking. And I was asking because this was like 6 years into my career, and I was never getting feedback like from my colleagues of how I could get better. I'm like, why the F do you guys actually come to me? And he's like, bro, it's just a way you explain shit and get into our heads. And that was the impetus to being like, well, why don't I talk about that more? Because everybody else in the world's already talking about training, and I love it, and I'll always have an interest in that. But the most you could learn about somebody, Don, with the art of coaching and communication was like, just love them up. They don't care what you know until they know how much you care. And I didn't like the Dr. Phil shit. When I was in the hospital, like at 90 pounds alone with no friends, like basically at war with my family because I wanted to get out of there, reading shit about like rah leadership, Dr. Phil, like, no, that wasn't going to help me. Like facing real stuff and understanding more about psychology and nuance was going to help me. So does that answer the question more effectively? Because I was trying not to be long-winded.
Yeah, no, it's fine. I want Derek to jump in, but the one thing I wanted to add to that was I also think that there's things that can be taught with coaching, and there's just things that can't be taught. And I think delivery, or when you said that Dr. Phil and that rah, like there's people who learn this stuff and they're not built in here to deliver it. And everything just sounds like, listen, I'm going to throw the guy under the bus. I don't mean to, but he had a very interesting career. Alex Rodriguez. Every time the guy can hit a baseball as good or better than anyone I've ever seen in my life. And then at a certain point in his career, he'd get in front of the media and the guy he would fumble. And everything he'd be saying, you literally would think that he was reading off of a sheet of paper as he's talking. And there was this lack of there was just this insincerity to him that I think forced a lot of people to really hate him. And what I've noticed with coaching is they very easily can go listen to someone like you. They're not going to be like you, or they're not going to be like Derek, because a lot of it, or my success didn't come down because I was the smartest coach. It came down because I was able to connect with people. And I'm able to look at someone in the eye and really care. And the next thing you know, I'm texting them hours later, checking them the next day. I'm not getting paid for that. I do that because I want to. And that's a part of coaching that I just think cannot be taught.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. And think about how you connect with people, right? Because this is what I think was misinterpreted by there's curmudgeons in every field, right? And I remember when I came out with the book, I was 30, and there's a subset that's like, oh, what does a 30-year-old know about this shit? And I could have easily been like, yo, were you hospitalized for a year of your life? Or when you did your first internship, was your brother stabbed by a drug dealer? Like, there's this idea that people of a certain age shouldn't share a message. And then there were some people that didn't even listen to the message. And so they would interpret a book about communication or the art of coaching as like I got riddled by the 1% of curmudgeons out there that are like, oh, buy-in, right? It became like it became a thing for like some strength coaches who wanted to seem cool in the midst of their peers who were fellow curmudgeons to be like, what do you think about this buy-in stuff? Or, oh, there's the buy-in guy and whatever. I'm like, yo, like you can think whatever you want about the term, but like, do you think of it that way because other people have spoiled it by not going into what it really means or how it's implemented? Or are you just mad that somebody wrote about a book and it wasn't you, you know, like, but when you communicate with your clients, whether it's athletes or celebrities or whatever, Don and Derek, feel free to weigh in. Like, I imagine it's not always, even when you're checking in to show that you care, warm, sing-songy shit. And that's not what we're not trying to promote. That we're trying to promote how do you deal with the darkness of things, the ambiguity of things, the chaos of things, the details of things. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. Is that how you guys coach? Is everything just bright, sunshiny, happy, or do you ever have to call somebody to task and get after them a bit?
Well, one thing I wanted to ask you was, and this is kind of a tangent, but all these skills that you've developed and all these experiences, how are you now using that in 2020 to make those connections? And you're not there maybe in person, and you're not, you know, you don't have that group around you, and you've got this energy. What advice do you have to people now? And I don't know, maybe for the next 6 months as we get the vaccines out and figure if they work or not, what kind of advice are you giving to people about bringing that energy and making that connection and using the right language, maybe because we're on Zoom or, you know, remotely?
Yeah. So you're talking about specifically in the context of training athletes virtually or something?
Yeah, or just connecting with people. Like you said, like, okay, when somebody, you know, calls me up and says, oh, I had a bad week, and, you know, how do I connect, you know,
In a
through
better,
phone? Yeah, in a
yeah.
better way, that's compassionate, that moves the needle for them. Maybe if I can't, and they might be in the same city where I normally go and hang out with them and say, hey, how's it going, right? How do you kind of maximize those opportunities?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and there's a couple ways. So I'll give you a variety of examples, and if they don't answer it to your level of satisfaction, let me know, because there's three ways I'm evaluating answering this. One is something that I learned through the research is communication breaks down to 8 different components, and I'm not talking verbal, nonverbal. I'm talking about there's when we communicate with people, there's the message we send, right? That's obvious, right? There's the people that are communicating, the context of their background, what have you. But there's also, and this is something that's often overlooked, I don't think it'll be overlooked as much in after 2020. There's the medium, right? The medium is right now we're talking via Zoom. There's phone, there's in person, there's multiple things. And the medium, the message, all these things can easily get lost in translation if you're not using a context rich medium. So for example, and this is the low lying fruit, if I quit a job, probably not going to do that over text if I want to have some semblance of respect, right? And so we often hear people talk about, oh, well, speak the language of that person or whatever. But a lot of times you got to find the medium that connects with them most. Here's another example. We have a coaching group. I don't like the term mastermind, but that's what it is, right? Where we're trying to improve in a wide area, and we have a lot of different people and a lot of professions in it. And a lot of us don't like social media beyond knowing, like, we know what we need to use it for, but it's not how we want to connect with each other. So what we found and what we use is an app called Marco Polo, which allows, it's not a social media platform. It's like a really quick video message that is more personal, intimate, succinct, and straightforward, where we can connect back and forth. And this group likes that better because it doesn't require them to log into Facebook or this, get distracted. It's direct. They don't have to read text. They don't have to type. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but like it would always drive me nuts on Facebook when somebody would be like, oh, let's see what Brett has to say. And you get tagged and you're like, dude, I don't want to type a 3-paragraph message that you just brought me into your conversation of what have you, right? So you have to look at how context rich is the medium you're using. Face to face, most context rich. We can not only determine tonality and facial expression and what have you, right? But there's this level of intimacy there. And we actually have an internal communication pyramid or hierarchy that we use for this based on how serious is the matter and who are we communicating to. In the context of the pandemic, the next most thing with highest media richness would be a Zoom call or a Marco Polo or a FaceTime, because again, it brings in verbal, nonverbal elements, fewer things are lost in translation. The least context rich medium is going to be like an email or a text, a lot of things can get lost in translation. Now, that said, you could have a context rich medium like Zoom, but if you have 130 people on it, the message still isn't as direct because the intimacy of that is decreased, right? And you guys see that. You get on a Zoom call and you're trying to keep 130 people engaged. There's no real secret to that, right? You can call everybody by name. You can have an interesting background. You can employ all the tricks and tactics you want. It's just not the right gear for the right hill. So you have to choose the right context rich medium. You have to facilitate engagement just through small things of holding people accountable, making them summarize what another speaker said, what have you. You have to be able to do that. I'll stop there and see if that answers your question. And if that doesn't, I have another direction I can go.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think what I like about your answer is it's diverse in terms of the options you're giving people, and there's individualization just like you would in coaching. So I think that those are all pretty important points, Don.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of shift to coaching a little bit, and
Yeah.
I wanted to see with the demographics you've been working with, which is mainly athletes, sport teams, right? I mean, now you're starting to roll off into businesses, right? I mean, companies are reaching out to you a bit. Can you jump into that a little bit? Because now that's
Yeah.
very similar, very different. And I wanted to add a point when you after your explanation.
For sure. I think one thing that's probably helpful to understand is so it first started taking off in like 2017 because, and it started with Microsoft where somebody was a sports fan, gave it to a guy in Microsoft who, sports fanatic, read about the archetypes, which, we just use as a model. An archetype is an example of something. So the woman that posts cat videos, the person that always wants to talk about politics, a hero or a villain, right? An example is it's just an example in a vacuum. And in the book, we talk about everybody has archetypical personas, but nobody's ever one way. Derek, you might act one way at a conference where you have to be scientifically oriented. And then when you're with your kids, you'll speak a different way, right? Like you're always anchored in your values, but you have to demonstrate different behaviors. Well, anyway, this guy at Microsoft had said, hey, we deal with these issues in our context as well. Sales team, our tech crew, all these people don't always see eye to eye, just like strength coaches don't see eye to eye always with sports scientists or medical. Would you come speak? But one early barrier to that, Don, was there's not a lot of people in strength and conditioning that had crossed over. You look at let's look at Navy SEALs, like a Jocko Willink, so to speak. There's a lot of military that have crossed over and written leadership books or go speak. Academics, Robert Sapolsky, or, look at Angela Duckworth, who wrote Grit. There's a lot of academics who have crossed over. My biggest barrier early on was people being like, what's a strength coach? Oh, you're like a personal trainer, or what I got is, oh, you're like Jillian Michaels. And I'm like, well, no. And so it was interesting because on one corner, I have all these strength and conditioning people who were like mad at me because I was creating a brand. But the whole purpose of me trying to create a brand was trying to create a platform for more strength coaches to leverage their expertise, right? From the weight room to the boardroom, of saying, hey, all these other professions do it. Why don't we? Because there's some really good people in our field that have a lot of knowledge. Share it. But there's also a lot of purists and zealots who think you're supposed to be seen, not heard. So I'm like fighting that off. In the meantime, I'm trying to help other people understand. There's some people intuitively in the corporate space that knew it, but then I'd still have to go out and explain it to them, because a lot of times I'd be brought in by leadership. But then when you're in front of the crowd, you have like 10 minutes in the context of your presentation to make the point of, hey, dealing with 30 athletes who collectively make $500 million in their contract is high stakes. No different than you guys when you're in the boardroom or you're rolling out initiatives as Wells Fargo have things that, oh, okay, now we get it. So that was a tough part of the early process, was not necessarily getting in the door with higher level stakeholders, but helping people bridge the gap, because there's not really been a strength coach. People don't look at the weight room as a place for leadership. They just don't. They look at the battlefield as leadership. They look at the classroom or research or academia as leadership. But if I'm like, hey, we're bridging the gap from the weight room to the boardroom, they're like, that doesn't really hit for a lot of people. So I think once we got through that and I started to, have that make sense to people and what have you, that really blew up. And then, yeah, I mean, this year, man, we had the opportunity to help somebody, a minority in his community who was running for mayor, brought us on to help with his marketing campaign for mayor. And so we've crossed that divide. but it's still it's still there where you've got to kind of explain it to a degree, which is why I don't really market myself as a strength coach anymore. I just market myself as a coach. I'm a coach. I don't really need some, pardon my language. I don't really need some like other determination of whether I'm a strength coach or a performance coach or, I'm certainly not a life coach. But it's like, I'm just a fucking coach. And that way I don't have to explain this stuff to people over and over and over again.
Well, and kind of the second part of my question, I'm going to pass it over to Derek, was, when you start working with a lot of these, people of business. I don't even know the politically right way to.
I like that. People of business.
People of business.
The People of Business podcast.
I think it's a better way. I think it's a better way to address it. But people of business who have found incredible level of success through, success. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say through happiness, but let's just say more from monetary success. Someone's working on Wall Street and they found a high level of success. Guy with a hedge fund, high level of success. Private equity, high level of success. But they struggle, right, to find a healthy lifestyle. Okay, they just their goal is they want. I always hear this line from them. I just want it. Why is it that I can be so successful in one area and not successful in the other area? When I think in reality, becoming successful financially or becoming successful with health, yes, there are, and I'm not saying that there isn't. There are bad draws. I just buried a very good friend of mine at 42 years of age.
Sorry to hear that.
Terrible, but it was of a terminal cancer, and he fought an awful battle for about 18 months. It was the worst way to go. Every week was a slow death. It's no one should go that way. He got dealt a bad hand. He tried to do everything in his power to, go off in a good path, but he was just dealt a poor hand. So I'm not saying everyone's in that category, but a lot of these people, they want it. They find success monetarily, but they can't find success from a health and wellness standpoint yet. In my opinion, they are very similar. Can you talk about that a little bit? Have you had a lot of experience dealing with someone who might be worth $100 million, but they just can't get that belly fat away off their waist?
Sure, 100%. I mean, one of the guys that we worked with this year was an investment banker that does a lot of mergers and acquisitions to that point, and definitely dealt a bad genetic hand with those things. And it is interesting because a lot of the questions was about diet as well. And you could argue, and I think he'd admit that there's some eating disorder behaviors and things there. And even when you put it in the context of, investing and an understanding of deposits, withdrawals, or long-term compound interest and what have you, he understands it rationally, right? But he's still got to act upon it. And, for him, unfortunately, and this is true for a lot of human behavior, is, when it comes to change, somebody's willingness to change rarely comes down to their intelligence, right? Like a willingness to change or a resistance to change comes down to one of five things. And I can't get credit for this. This was from a sociologist named Kurt Lewin. Now, we've adapted the categories because some of the categories were in some jargon and relatively ambiguous. But one of the categories was tradition, right? There's some people that just feel like they're so rooted in the way they've always done things. And this is very true of this investment banker. Like, he knows there's a problem, but there's also this rhythm of how his life moves. And to make changes, no matter how small, he just felt like was going to throw him off. Now, some of that stubbornness or what have you. Suppression is another reason people resist change. There are certain people in positions of power or status that if a change is proposed, they tend to feel like, well, this might rob me of certain status, right? Let's say Derek, and Derek's not like this, but let's say Derek was a position of a head strength and conditioning coach, and somebody coming up under him is really getting a lot of momentum and building a name for themselves, right? And Derek kind of blackballs him or blacklists him for like, that's an example of suppression. Now, people will do that sometimes when you give them diet, nutrition advice, or performance advice, is, if they feel like it's clashing with their views, or they feel like maybe they were a little bit too vulnerable and they showed you a side of themselves that they're ashamed by, they can quickly lean upon their status to be like, well, I don't have time for that. I'm dealing with real problems right now. And you're like, oh, okay, well, like, that's interesting because this is a pretty real problem. But yeah, by all means, go make that $10 million deal. I'm totally sure that'll get rid of your comorbidities of a heart attack and shit. Cool. Then, and there's a myriad of them. I can go into the rest if you want, but you have to figure out what that sticking point is for them. and then be able to reframe what you're trying to do in a context that they understand. And then here's the other thing, man, and this is why people don't like it, Don. Here's the reality. Trust is a long process. Everybody wants this shit quick, and they're like, well, you're the buy-in guy. Why don't you tell me how to do it quickly? I go, there is nothing I talk about that says how to do it in 5 minutes. I'm not the guy that's going to tell you how to, hey, get faster in 5 seconds in the 40-yard dash by doing this. Like, fuck that. Like, trust is a long game. And if you're not in it for the long game, then get out of the game. Go do something else. So, hopefully that gives you some insight, but it should also scare away the hackers who are like, yeah, man, give me that one tip. Can't. Know them, know their world, learn how to reframe and rephrase things so it sticks. Wait, observe, see how they react. Take that, chess, not checkers. Keep playing the game, rinse, wash, and repeat.
I love it. Derek.
Yeah. We talk a lot about changing behaviors and getting people on the right track. A lot of the time I see, and even people that I've worked with, what's the sustainability of that? How do you maintain that? Because, we've all seen it. I've lost a lot of weight. And then, they do the Oprah and it's back on again. Right. And that might be also something with training or something that would help them prevent injury, but they just don't stay on track with it. What are you doing to maintain that durability of your change or your recommendations? And sometimes, as we all know, they may talk to somebody else and that person may say something that they like. And so they gravitate towards that person and get away from what really worked that you established. What are some?
Well, it's funny you say that. So some of the stuff that we've dove into is the medical literature. There's a great article that talks about the necessary balance of competence and warmth, right? Specifically when your doctor gets it being, their profession, their trade, what have you, and gets you. And what they find, to your point, is just that, Derek, is, people can have a great procedure. Like I'll use myself as an example. I just had a slap repair on my right shoulder. 5 years ago, I was doing a Turkish get up. I was in the middle of coming back down. Two athletes who were horsing around, one pushed one into me from behind, shoulder dislocated, labrum torn. I had lived with it for 5 years. It was time to get something done. Well, I had reached out to the best surgeon I know who works at the Andrews Institute, who recommended me to the best surgeon he knew who worked in Atlanta. Great surgeon. A slap repair is a routine Monday before lunch to him. But the follow-up care and the communication was awful. And many people who have experienced healthcare can appreciate this. Like for the follow-up, they were supposed to have images and details of the surgery and what have you. We drove an hour and a half and they were like, oh, the images, sorry, didn't render. And I'm like, you couldn't have talked to us about this. I didn't get to meet with him post-operatively, what have you. So I ranked, when they sent me that feedback form, the level of care as lower than I would have had the surgery been effective, and there actually just been any semblance of communication and follow-up, even an attempt. Just call me. I understand you're busy. And they say that healthcare practitioners right now, because of the way insurance is, generally have 10 to 15 minutes at most to spend with a patient. But as coaches, we're very adept at micro interactions, and we know how to do that. And so when you look at these things and making something stick, you have to find that necessary balance, almost like the force velocity curve. If I want an adaptation, I got to train it in the right zone. And in coaching, you have a lot of people who are so worried about seeming like the most knowledgeable, the most avant-garde, they don't realize they're coming off like douchebags. Right. And so great, you give me the competence and what have you. And then on the other hand, as we know, there's also these charlatans, that they come off as great and very likable. And Don, you see it in the fitness market, how many people start like their captions with, I'm not sure who needs to hear this today, but you're good enough. Right. And it's like, cool, you're relatable. I get it. It's formulaic, but you're also fucking with me because like 5 other people did that same post today. Right. And so you have to find that balance. And there's also a gray area because, Derek, the outcome, and I always try to give the audience something like tactical. There's 3 outcomes that you and Don you touched on with something sticking. There's commitment, there's compliance, and there's resistance. And I promise this isn't just like nomenclature for the sake of nuance, right? There's research behind this. Commitment, what you're shooting for, Don, is you want somebody to feel good about you and the task, right? So, hey, Carl, I want, like, here's what we're going to do. And I've got to explain it to him in a way that he feels good about how I'm framing it up. And also like, yeah, it seems like a reasonable thing to him. So he's going to go forth with great commitment. Compliance And this is where a lot of people mistake buy-in. They think they're getting buy-in, but true buy-in is trust and commitment. Compliance is, I either feel good about you, but I'm iffy on the task, or I feel good about the task, but I'm still iffy on you, right? It's not there. And then resistance is, nah, I don't feel good about what you're asking me to do, and I don't really believe in you as a person yet. So that's what we're trying to go for, Derek, and what we're trying to aim with.
Really, really quick, you just remind me of something because my best friend went for a late labral surgery yesterday, and he stayed at my house 2 nights ago in the snowstorm. We were getting murdered with the snowstorm, and I bring him down to Huntington Hospital, and he goes in and he meets with this young surgeon, and I drop him off at 6 a.m. and I'm picking him up at noon, and I ran out earlier, probably around 10:30 a.m. right when he was coming out of surgery because I thought he was going to come out of the hospital. I was going to try and kind of meet him there, and the surgeon calls me up. He literally calls me up because I was the point of contact, and he sat there and he broke the surgery down for me, and he's like, listen, he was enthusiastic, and he was like very present. He was like, listen, unbelievable. Couldn't have gone any better. Little nerve blockage. He's going to have a little drooping in the face. He goes through this whole detail. And when I hung up the phone, 10 minutes later, his supervisor called me. I've never experienced this before. The supervisor, his boss, Dr. Bill Healy, calls me up. And he broke everything down for me. And I didn't say, hey, listen, I said, yeah, Dr. Trasolini called me. He's like, no, but I just want to walk you through it. And I was so beyond impressed and I can't tell you how many times I hear, everyone's the number one hip surgeon. Everyone's the number one back surgeon. I mean, there's more number one back and hip surgeons than anywhere. I mean, they're all over the place. Yeah, we said to so-and-so at Sloan, he's the number one. I'm like, yeah, sure. For me, like, in a way, it's even with coaching. There are coaches out there that will be smarter than the next coach. And yes, we want a competent surgeon. I'm not saying that we don't, but coaching's a little bit different. I want someone who is present. I want someone who is there and cares and is passionate and is not sitting in here at some equinox saying, all right, the session's up. I'm going to get my next, $50 in a session if they were even lucky to make that. So, when you told me that story, it kind of, I feel terrible that you went through that. And it's if anything, I guess it's a learning curve somehow. But
yeah, well, I mean, it's to your point. What we found is when I had to submit a proposal for kind of what we're doing on the communication side of coaching for my doctorate, because my doctorate is all about validating these workshops that we do that teach the communication side of things. Like, we don't want to just start a certification and have so we have tons of research behind it, but we're also conducting our own. And one of the things we shared with the research committee to get the approval is we had to show other professions that we're doing this, and medicine's way ahead of it because they have to be. But over $15 billion alone, Don, is lost per year in American healthcare system due to poor communication, whether that's through litigious issues or even just miscommunications of too many patients in hospital beds that should have been discharged. And so what I realized, and Derek's on the opposite side of this, but like, it doesn't mean that Derek doesn't deal with it. And I'd never assume, because like, speed is something that's coveted, right? In performance, speed is like, everybody wants to learn about speed. You're not going to find many people that don't want to learn about speed. You start selling them on communication, and you know what you hear? Well, I communicate every day. And I go, well, I wake up as a husband every day. I don't become a better husband. Or like, if I want to learn the Olympic lift, sure, I could teach myself, but you'd have to make a hard argument that I wouldn't be better with a coach. Now, there's always a smart ass that's like, well, it depends on the coach. And I'm going to say, listen, here's the gist of it. Empires have fallen because of shitty communication. Like, marriages have been marred because of it. But like, I've had to help people make sense of what we mean by communication. Like, everybody goes through life having to negotiate. Everybody goes through life having to assert themselves. Everybody goes through life having to listen to somebody. Everybody goes through life, but like, they've never been evaluated on it. Yet the medical field, the legal field, all these other fields recognize the issue. And so the frustration is strength and conditioning oftentimes, and it's a lot better now. If I was talking to you 4 years ago, I'd be like, oh my God, I'm going to lose my mind. Now what we have is, at our workshops, we've had FBI analysts, strength coaches, athletic directors, HR. We have all these people coming because they realize, yeah, this shit is costing me business, or this is costing me my health, or I just got divorced. One guy was about to commit suicide because his wife left him because he was chasing strength coach job after strength coach job after strength coach job. And he was great on the floor, but really shitty at home. Yeah. Right. So let's talk about that side of coaching too. But yeah, the healthcare system is a great example of where poor communication has really been insidious. And God bless your friend and that doctor for like not being an example of that, because that's all it takes is a simple call. It doesn't take some massive intervention, just like show up kind of and navigate your social world with a little bit of like self-awareness.
You know, it's the one point to young coaches that I like to make. Like, reach out to someone when they're least expecting it, and you know, you're a perfect example. Like, what can I do for you? Like, I love that line, and it's something that's so simple, and it is the most powerful sales tool I feel like out there for any coach.
Yeah, certainly. In listening to you guys talk about like the best doctor, the best hip surgeon, it reminds me of that scene in Elf when he says "world's best cup of
Prince
coffee."
coffee.
Yeah,
You did it. Well, that's like too, it's like the mission statement or vision statement of companies where they're like, through world-class this and world-class customer service. And I'm like, God, there's a lot of world-class people out there.
yeah. So my question to you guys, both of you, is differentiation. How do you do that? How do you accomplish that if you're the communicator and Don is the expert fitness consultant? And we talked a bit about that engagement piece and following up and all. But what is the key differentiation point for you guys to separate yourselves from the other people out there, other experts? Sorry.
Don, do you want to go first or do you want me to go?
Yeah, I mean, Derek, just to be clear about the question, how do I separate myself from other coaches trying to do the same thing?
Yeah, yeah. Like if we,
Yeah,
this is a really arbitrary way, but like if I looked at all the top fitness professionals and strength coaches on Instagram, like what is, how are you going to differentiate yourself?
I've actually, and I'm curious to, and Brett's going to give an honest answer here. But I feel like I can't. There's so much fluff and there's so much noise in the background that if I'm on social media every day, and listen, I keep my eye on people's I really respect. Brett Bartholomew, Derek Hansen. Like, there's certain people that I look at, and everything I look at, I admire, and it's motivational, it's educational, it's valuable information for me. But I also can't go out there and try and be Brett Bartholomew or Derek Hansen. I got to be Don Saladino, and I got to deliver my message. I got to rely on one of my best tools, and that's a level of empathy that I have for every person that I work with, whether it's thousands of challengers, whether it's, me giving too much of my time, or me, spending too much time answering messages for people that aren't paying me any money. That's who I am. That's how I am. That's something that might be looked at as a negative from a lot of business people in the fitness industry, happens to be one of my strengths. So how do I differentiate myself? I really don't. I don't focus on that. I just focus on being me, continuing my own education, continuing to get better, continuing to strengthen my team every day, and understanding I can't do everything at once, but continue to wake up and be me. And that's how I can answer that.
Yeah, I'd say, and that makes a lot of sense. Don, let me address yours first. Like, because there is this myth that there's this perfect thing and you need to model it. And the research shows, because we had to look at a lot of coach education to kind of see where we could fill the gaps, is the majority of coaches say they learn how to coach either by mimicking somebody that they were coached by or by mimicking a successful coach, right? And that's not good. That's not good that there's people out there that think that there's a model that they have to fit. It's just not appropriate, because not everybody wants those things. Like, people don't need to be a you or a Derek or a John Wooden or what have you, because for every John Wooden out there, there's a Bobby Knight who choked kids and threw chairs, and there are some people that invited him to his wedding and love him to death and what have you. Derek, the succinct billboard answer to this is I've always used contrast. So if an athlete comes to me, I always just make it real clear. I'm the guy that you come to when you realize half the shit on Instagram doesn't work. And the earliest way I did that, and I give credit to Richie, is when I was definitely a zealot and anti-social media and all that. And this is before Instagram. Richie had asked me, why don't you have social media? And I was like, real coaches don't have social media, because I just regurgitated what I was told. And I believed it at that time, if I'm honest. And he said, well, you help interns out and you talk to us. You don't think you could teach anybody else? So I was like, yeah, valid point. And I'll cut the rest. But the point is when I first started sharing on social media, I differentiated myself using contrast by being the guy that showed elite athletes doing simple shit. So I'd be like, here's Whitney Merciless doing an RDL, like here's Jacoby Ellsbury doing a squat. And I think that kind of appeased, if I'm being honest, the old guard, because I never wanted to be somebody that came in as some know-it-all. I wanted to, I mean, I come from Nebraska, right? Which, you know, we can all debate about origins of strength and conditioning. And I know it was certainly before Nebraska, but Nebraska played a role in that lore. And so, you know, I just always wanted to respect that. And I was like, hey, if I'm going to come on the scene, I'm going to show how, yeah, I'm a young guy at the time, but I'm respecting older principles. And I'm not trying to differentiate myself by making elite athletes do circus shit. We're showing people do simple things at high detail. And I think even now, just like I have no desire to compete against somebody like with that shit. Like I'm my own competition with that. And so it's like, I'm not going to sit here and convince somebody to train with me, just like I'm not going to convince a corporation to work with me. And what I found is, oddly enough, you don't have to. When you make it clear what you're not, it makes it easier for people to understand what you are, you know? And I think you got to stick to your guns. I admittedly did have a little bit of imposter, or not imposter phenomenon, but like battling with myself. Don, this goes to your earlier question too about working with corporations. I would say 2 years ago, I wondered, I knew to advance what I was doing bigger picture, I had to quit coaching athletes part of the year. But then I was worried that if I wasn't coaching athletes part of the year, would I no longer be perceived as a strength coach? And then I realized, like, I don't really give a shit. I don't know right now if Dr. Dre or Kendrick Lamar are making music, and they are still musicians. When Dr. Dre went from a rapper to a producer, I don't think that he lost a lot of respect from people being like, he doesn't rap. When not Bill Gates, when Steve Jobs went from like building MacBooks to just leading Apple, I'm sure there were some people that were like, you don't even design computers anymore. But I just realized, like, I don't really care about those critics. If somebody sees me speaking on a stage at Wells Fargo, I could give a shit if they're like, oh, he's not coaching athletes anymore. Sure, I am seasonally. And by the way, why do I have to coach them at all hours of every day to be a coach? And that's just not somebody's opinion I give a shit about anymore, but I used to. So it held me back in my career progression, if that makes sense.
You're in the business of improvement. I mean, you're using a foundation that you've spent your whole life developing before you're even a coach, and you needed to go through that stuff to be the coach you are today. And you've done that to now help people improve. And that's why even with social media, I'll second your opinion back in the day. I mean, I went through the same thing. It wasn't until one of my coworkers, Tiago Passos, 8-9 years ago, was like, you need to get on Facebook. And I'm like, that information, that's my private information,
Yeah.
all that stuff. Like that's bullshit. And now, you try and deliver content to people to make them better. And
You're a coach.
great.
Like, why do I have to be because somebody asked me the other day along those lines, like, hey, when did you decide? And they meant it in a well-meaning way. It wasn't a snarky tone, but they were like, did you eventually decide that like coaching wasn't enough for you, or what made you kind of expand, essentially the ambit of what you're doing? And I said, well, like, I get what you're asking, but be careful with your words. All I decided is I didn't want to coach just weights anymore.
Right.
I'm still coaching people daily. I'm just not coaching them endlessly on the clean, because Derek, we know where that conversation goes, right? Then all of a sudden it's a simply faster debate of, should athletes catch the clean or drop the clean? Should they do full cleans, hang clean? Should they go above the knee or below the knee? I don't know anybody in the special forces who sits there and after 16 years in serving our country argues about how to load a gun. Like they may have that conversation to a degree, but like there's not a blog.
Yeah, you're right.
But it's embarrassing. And I'm like, guys, are you just bored? Like, at what point are you just, and that's not a shot at anybody. Our crowd always likes to think that that's just me. I mean, when the pandemic hit, Don, I remember going in and seeing the NSCA strength and conditioning Facebook group. And there were coaches arguing about what cleaning product is best, or whether face masks, degrade performance in the weight room. And I'm like, what is this? Like,
but listen, not to give a jab at them, but I'm going to. But they're the ones who are struggling in the business anyway. I mean, I find those are the ones that 10 years later, they become bitter because they wonder why they haven't been able to grow. They haven't been able to find happiness in that business because they are living in a specific box. They're not able to turn around and recognize the areas. Like my best quality, the thing I'm as good, if not better than anyone I've ever met in my life, is that I recognize what I'm not good at, and I surround myself with people who could either teach me or can come in and lend me support. Like,
and like you said, it's a tough love jab. It's not saying you're better than, but it's just like, how rooted in insecurity and competition are we that we want to make everything an argument? And you can hear it now. If one of those coaches heard it, they'd be like, oh, sorry. Oh, Mr. Conscious Coaching doesn't think the care of our athletes is important to debate enough about. And I'm like, you're proving my point by being so argumentative all the time. Just relax. And
Right.
that's one thing, like just see a bigger picture. But you go to these conferences and you hear these arguments or whatever, and you just got to get above it. Like every profession has their things, and it's very hard to be a good coach, let alone have any kind of balance of bigger picture thinking, if you don't remove your emotional self from like what you identify with so closely. It's weird. So contrast is the short answer to that question, Derek.
So on that note, what do you have available to sell us now? Let's get to the point. What kind of things are you doing right now that people can check up on? And
My book Titan. No, I'm kidding. That's really, we have a lot of digital stuff. We have books, live events, courses, digital guidance. We do communication training, and that's not for somebody that feels like they slur their words. That's for somebody that maybe is pivoting into a business side of things and they feel insecure about selling themselves. They don't know how to do that. It could be somebody that is having a hard time reaching certain athletes or certain parts of their organization. I mean, the number one thing we get is people that are dealing with work conflicts or interpersonal conflicts, and they're trying to figure out how they can be more effective communicators, and they're looking for outside just analysis. No different than people do with you with their running mechanics. Is they recognize we spend the vast majority of our life communicating, but do we do it wisely and well? So my book's on Amazon, everything's on Art of Coaching. We have a podcast, and yeah, we're just looking to have meaningful conversations about these things. And we have an evaluation. Our online course is CEU approved. So it just depends what people are looking for, but
How many books have you written so far?
so my book came out 3 years ago because I don't write unless I really have something to say. But you guys are amongst the first to know that I'm working on another book. It has nothing to do with strength and conditioning. It can certainly be used for that, but I am working on another book, and Lord willing, that will be out once I decide what to do with the publishing side of it, whether I'm going to go self or whether I'm going to look at a publishing agent or what have you, late next year.
And that's, just to be clear, that's Art of Coaching.
Yeah, thanks for saying that. Yeah, it's Art of Coaching, not the Art of
Yep.
Coaching. They're all about volleyball and good on them. We're about leadership, communication, and psychology. Thanks for that distinction, Derek.
But the book is Conscious Coaching, which you said
the
to me.
book is
Hold up.
Conscious Coaching.
Okay, and you sent that book to me 3 years ago, and I actually recently, because of all the challenges I've been working with, I put it on my list of my favorites.
Well, I appreciate that, man.
Must read. There's so many examples that I can pull from that book that I don't know. I don't think you need to be a coach to be able to absorb that stuff and to be able to actually utilize it.
No, and dude, and you early adopter, really supportive, as was Derek. But like today, if the end of the day goes well, it will have crossed 200,000 copies self-published, which does not sound impressive, and it isn't compared to the people that sell millions and millions. But just I look at it as a win for like other coaches, because I was told basically nobody's going to care about a book a strength coach wrote, this and that and what have you. We don't have media. Like I couldn't get it on Hoda and Kathy Lee or anything like that when that was a thing, or the Today Show. It's all had to be organic, hand to hand. And so it's been a long road, dude, and it's hard not to tear up. And I'm sure there's plenty of people that hate the book, but my wife and I, we put our last dime into making it. And so, yeah, we're not ashamed of it, and we're going to keep it. It just got translated into its 5th language. And yeah, so thank you to both of you that use it and just were open to it.
Well, listen, I think you're the perfect example of someone who just, you're a grinder, dude. Like you really are. Like you are 100% a fighter in this industry. And you're someone who, listen, it wasn't handed you on a silver platter. You had to fight for every inch of it. And I know Derek and I have a tremendous amount of respect for you. When someone asks me about you, I think I have the same response every time. I go, that's a real coach. Like he's a real coach, and he's beyond a coach. So listen, it's been great, calling you our friend. And can you tell everyone about the social media handles besides your .com? Where can they find you on Instagram?
Yep, just at Coach Brett _B. So it's pretty easy. It's a verified account. I know there's some fake ones out there, so look for the blue check. Search my name, but at Coach _Brett B is pretty straightforward, and you can just find all that by going to artofcoaching.com. So that's always the easiest way, where you don't have to deal with underscores and ambiguity of spelling and what have you. Just go there and you'll have all the directness. And yeah, thanks for mentioning that. The respect is certainly mutual.
Thank you.
Well,
So listen,
people are impersonating you. You must be successful.
Yeah, right. A Russian bot. I think they impersonate everybody, right? Like they find stock photos and they're like, "Hello, my name is Peter." So I'm just, yeah, no, you do not. I am
Unconscious hacking.
Unconscious coaching of the hacking. Yeah, something.
Awesome.
And how's your baby? How old now?
1 year as of yesterday, man. I appreciate you asking. Yeah, little Bronson is a champion. Yeah, so it's just, I said yesterday, parenting, and you guys both know this, teaches you more about coaching and leadership than anything else, and makes you well accustomed to every aspect of your inferiority and how you got to get better. And so, yeah, little guy's 1 year old. Thanks for mentioning that.
Well, listen, I know 1 year old around the holidays is when they start, affiliating that happiness. I mean, this is a great time. You're going through it. You and your wife enjoy the little one. Thanks again for coming on. We know you've been slammed, and we'll check in with you in 2021.
Thank you guys. Appreciate you.
All right, bro. Thanks,
Brett.
Bye.